In tonight's news edition, the Prime Minister and the Arab League chief discussed challenges facing the region and the threat of terrorism. Daesh militants set fire to oil wells northeast of the Iraqi city of Tikrit to stop advancing Iraqi troops. And the U.S. Secretary of State assures Gulf Arab states that a nuclear deal with Iran will be in their interests. Good evening and very warm welcome to the news. His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, called on the General Command of the Armed Forces, the Arab Army, and discussed with the Army Chief a number of military affairs. King Abdullah and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mishal Zebin, who is also the King's military advisor, discussed a number of issues of concern to the armed forces. The King commended the outstanding level of the armed forces, or the armed forces have reached. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour and Arab League Secretary General Nabil Arabi discussed the current situation in the region and efforts to address challenges facing the Arab nation. Mansour and the Arab League chief agreed on the need for a united Arab stance to deal with the regional threats, mainly terrorism and extremism, and to safeguard Arab security. Mansour and Al-Arabi also called for promoting moderate religious ideology that maximizes the right to live and coexist. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Judah and the head of the Pan-Arab Organization discussed issues on the agenda of the ministerial meeting of the Arab League Council. The fight against terrorism and extremist organizations also figured high on the meeting, which stressed coordination among Arab countries to counter this danger.
We are always keenly interested to communicate and coordinate with the Arab League. But in this stage, in particular, we talked about the challenges facing us as an Arab nation and our battle against terrorism and extremism, as well as the required coordination among Arab countries in this regard. We also talked about the next summit and the ministerial meeting, which will be held on the 9th of this month, when Jordan will take over the Arab League Council's presidency for 6 months.
UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, His Highness Prince Zeid Ra'ad, called for an international campaign to discredit Daesh militant group. The top United Nations human rights official urged Muslims worldwide to defend their faith against misrepresentation by violent extremists. Prince Zeid, a former Jordanian ambassador who is the first Arab and Muslim to serve in the UN post, was making his first annual report to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. He noted that much media coverage in the West was devoted to Daesh's abductions or killings of Westerners or Christian minorities. The human rights chief denounced murders, torture, mass beheadings and genocidal attacks on minorities in Syria, Iraq and Libya by Daesh, also known as ISIL.
The fact that a vast majority of ISIL's victims are fellow Muslims receives far less publicity. A real campaign of ideas to discredit ISIL will need to mobilize such facts. It should also seek to infuse fresh courage into the overwhelming majority of peaceful and tolerant Muslims around the world, to encourage them to take a stand and voice the essential nature of their faith.
The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, has urged the international community to further support humanitarian workers and hosting countries as they face challenges from an increased number of radicalized groups. During his address at the last session of the regional consultations held at the Dead Sea, ICRC President Peter Mora said the international community is not as involved as it should be. He said the growing number of radicalized groups is making it difficult for humanitarian workers to do their job because their lives are being threatened.
It is indeed a huge problem in this region and in some other regions of the world. Humanitarian actors have increasingly difficulties accessing to people in need. And the reason is that we are confronted with an increasing number of very radical groups taking civilian populations hostage. This is happening from northern Nigeria to this region to other parts of the world, and a big concern.
Over to Iraq, Daesh militants have set fire to oil wells northeast of the Iraqi city of Tikrit as the Iraqi army pressed on with an offensive to recapture the key city. The militants were trying to obstruct an assault by Shiite militiamen and Iraqi soldiers, trying to drive them from the city and surrounding towns in the Salah ad-Din province. A military source said Daesh fighters ignited the fire at the Ajil oil field to shield themselves from attacks by Iraqi military helicopters. A military source said a suicide bomber from Daesh last night drove an explosives-laden tanker into a camp on the eastern edge of the town of Ad-Dur, killing a leader of the Iranian-backed Asaib Ahl al-Haq or Asaib Ahl al-Haq militia, Mahdi al-Kinani, and 4 others. A police source said an 8-vehicle convoy of Daesh militants attacked Iraqi forces at dawn, and the army returned fire, killing 4 militants and burning 2 of their cars. French President François Hollande welcomed the head of Syria's Western-backed political opposition for a meeting at the Élysée Palace. The head of the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Force, Khalid, is trying to ally with opposition groups based in Syria to boost its legitimacy and help revive peace talks that center on a political transition in the country. Hoxha, who became president in January, has said that the group's goal was still for President Bashar al-Assad to leave power, but that it was no longer a precondition to begin talks. Hoxha said that the key was to end the bloodshed. He said he had some success after secret talks arranged by France 10 days ago with the Domestic National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change. The two sides agreed for the first time on a joint roadmap calling for a transitional governing body. In other news now, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was in Riyadh to try to reassure Saudi Arabia's King Salman and other Gulf Arab states that any nuclear deal with Iran will be in their interest. Kerry flew to Riyadh from Switzerland, where Iran and 6 world powers today held a new round of nuclear talks. This report has more.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry briefed Gulf Arab foreign ministers in Riyadh on progress he reported in 3 days of nuclear talks with Iran. He offered the Gulf Cooperation Council countries reassurance that any deal would not damage their interests. Kerry flew to Riyadh last night from Montreux, Switzerland, where he said he made progress in talks with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif that aim to conclude an atomic deal by the end of March. Kerry also held a separate meeting with Oman's Foreign Minister Yusuf bin Alawi bin Abdullah. He told Gulf Arab states Washington is not seeking what he called a grand bargain with Iran, and said a nuclear deal with Tehran would be in their interests. The Gulf Arab states are concerned that Iran will gain from any agreement to end years of dispute over its nuclear ambitions.
From the beginning, these negotiations have been tough and intense, and they remain so. And we've made some progress from where we were, but there are still significant gaps and important choices that need to be made. The purpose of these negotiations is not to get any deal, it's to get the right deal.
Back in Montreux, Switzerland, the Iranian foreign minister started a new round of talks with the representatives of the so-called P5+1 countries, comprising the United States, China, Russia, France, Britain, and Germany. Zarif said they were moving closer to a nuclear deal, but cautioned there were details that needed to be worked out. China's representative at the talks said he sees hope of a deal before the end of June deadline.
In fact, that we are at the final stage of our efforts for a comprehensive agreement, if I may say so. We do think that starting from the last February, we've already put enormous efforts and lots of rounds of meetings in Vienna and in Geneva as well, and now we are in Montreux. So if I may say so, that we do think it's a last stage, and hopefully we could reach an agreement.
They hoped for agreement would curb sensitive Iranian nuclear work in exchange for sanctions relief, but Kerry said significant gaps remained to be negotiated. Hibel Atum for the news at 10.
And back here at home, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour and the Iraqi Transport Minister Baqir al-Zubaydi agreed to follow up on agreements signed by the two countries, including railway linkage. Mansour said Jordan's relations are with the Iraqi state, not with a specific political regime. He added that the kingdom's stance is clear towards the neighboring country, and the underpinning of these relations is not to interfere in any internal affairs. Mansour complained that Iraq-bound Jordanian trucks laden with fruit and vegetables are subjected to prolonged searches and called for easing the restrictions. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Nasser Judi and Libyan Foreign Minister Mohammed al-Dairi discussed Jordanian-Libyan ties and the fight against terrorism. Judi reiterated Jordan's support for Libyan aspirations to rebuild the war-torn country. The Libyan minister expressed his country's willingness to benefit from Jordan's expertise in labor, judicial training and rehabilitating the administrative body. Judi said after the talks that Jordan supports the dialogue in Libya in order to reach a national accord in which security and stability will be restored in the North African country. U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Mark Lippert underwent surgery after he was slashed in the face by a Korean nationalist in an attack at a forum in Seoul to discuss Korean reunification. The attack was to protest against joint military exercises by South Korea and U.S. troops. This report has more.
New video shows the U.S. ambassador to South Korea moments after he was slashed in the face. Mark Lippert was at a forum in Seoul to discuss Korean reunification when police say Kim Ki-jong attacked him with a knife.
I need an ambulance fast. Get me to the hospital. Okay.
Doctors say Lippert suffered an 11-centimeter gash across his face that required 80 stitches.
You guys gotta stop this bleeding here. Yeah.
He also suffered a puncture wound on his wrist, which his doctors say caused nerve damage that was repaired in surgery. The U.S. Embassy's Robert Ogburn says Lippert is recovering well.
The ambassador is awake and in good spirits, and he wishes to convey how appreciative he is of the well wishes from President Park.
The assailant, 55-year-old Kim, is being described as a Korean nationalist. Police say the attack was a protest against joint U.S.-South Korean military drills that began this week. It wasn't Kim's first run-in with a foreign dignitary. In 2010, he tried to attack the Japanese ambassador to South Korea by throwing a piece of concrete. Across the border in North Korea, the response was not surprising. The official KCNA news agency says the attack is, quote, deserved punishment for the warmongering United States.
A Turkish warplane has crashed near the central Anatolian city of Konya, killing the two pilots. It was the second fatal air accident for Turkey's armed forces in less than 2 weeks. Turkey's chief of staff said in a statement that the F-4E took off from an air base on a planned training flight this morning and came down nearly an hour later. An inquiry is already underway to discover why two training jets went down in Malatya province on February the 24th, killing 4. Turkey has the second largest military in NATO, and its air force has played an active role in patrolling its troubled borders with Syria and Iraq. A large winter storm reaching from Texas to southern New England prompted schools to close and led to almost 2,300 flight cancellations. The storm had dumped over 30 centimeters of snow on parts of the eastern United States by early morning. The National Weather Service said Kentucky was buried under snow, with 41 centimeters reported in the city of Radcliffe and over a foot falling elsewhere in the state. It said parts of Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana and Ohio recorded as much as 28 centimeters of snow. Forecasters warned of dangerous travel conditions throughout the region. To the world of glamour and style, Argentina's top fashion moguls convened for the final day of the 7th edition of the Designer's Look of Buenos Aires Fashion Week 2015, presenting their winter collections. The day saw Cora Groppo hit the stage with an edgy female collection of moody, neutral colors, winter wools and leathers in masculine cuts with rough finishings, topped with black skull caps. Laurencio Adet provided a visual counterbalance to these textures in his show of precision in both his patterns and cuts. His collection was inspired by important moments in women's history. Another highlight of the event was catwalk of sustainable designs created from recyclable and organic materials. The Japan Football Association is close to signing a deal with Bosnian coach Vahid Halilhodžić. A deal could be in place before friendlies against Tunisia and Uzbekistan this month. Halilhodžić was at the helm during Ivory Coast's unbeaten run through 2010 World Cup qualifiers. He also coached surprise package Algeria at the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, where the Algerians were knocked out of the last 16 in extra time by Germany. Four-time Formula One world champion Sebastian Vettel, who moved from Red Bull at the end of last year, said he hoped Ferrari could become the strongest challengers to Mercedes this season. Mercedes' double world champion Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg are widely expected to dominate again this year, with the Briton winning 11 races and his teammate 5 last season. The Silver Arrows have looked ominous in testing ahead of the season-opening Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne on March the 15th.
Deswegen ist die Vorbereitung in dem Sinne, glaube ich, ideal. Und dann stehen einem die Wege offen. Wie gesagt, ich denke, die Formel 1 bietet.
Finally, a look at the weather forecast. Cold tonight in most regions with southeasterly moderate winds. A rise in temperatures tomorrow will create pleasant weather across much of the hilly areas, with temperatures hovering around the low 20s. The Jordan Valley should expect or enjoy a warm day tomorrow, especially across its southernmost parts. Winds tomorrow will continue to be southeasterly moderate, picking up at times. And further south, a warm day in the port of Aqaba with northerly fresh winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To close, our top stories once again. The Prime Minister and the Arab League chief discuss challenges facing the region and the threat of terrorism. Daesh militants set fire to oil wells northeast of the Iraqi city of Tikrit to stop advancing Iraqi troops. And the U.S. Secretary of State assures Gulf Arab states that a nuclear deal with Iran will be in their interests. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name is Raad Liptouj. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good night.